Hello and welcome back to another episode of Majlis and Markets with your host, Hassan Jivraj. In this podcast, we aim to bring you thought-provoking conversations with influential leaders in Islamic and global markets. As usual, however you're listening to this podcast, and wherever you're listening, please remember to like, share and subscribe. It really does help us. In today's episode, we're exploring Islamic finance in Australia. In recent years, Islamic finance has gained traction in Australia. With Muslims comprising 3.2% of the population and a median age of 27, their financial needs align closely with their religious beliefs. Moreover, Australia's trade with Muslim nations like Indonesia and the UAE underscore the growing importance of Islamic finance. Yet despite these positive trends and indicators, the industry faces challenges, including unfavourable regulations and raising awareness. Joining us to navigate this landscape is Imran Lum, Head of Islamic Finance at a major bank in Australia. During our discussion, Imran shares his insights on overcoming these challenges and advancing Islamic finance in Australia. Imran Lum, welcome to Majlis and Markets. Good to have you here.
Ahlan, welcome, bro. Oh boy,
Ahlan,
sorry,
ahlan.
you're welcoming me.
Ahlan wa sahlan. Yeah,
Ahlan, big Habibi.
yeah, it's really great to have you on the podcast. I'm actually returning the favor after nearly 3 years, I think, when I
Yeah,
appeared on your podcast.
I think it
So
was second COVID at the time.
yeah, exactly. And it's like a real pleasure to return the favor. And I think you're
Oh,
obviously one of the other people. There was a couple of people who motivated me to do this podcast, and I think you were one of the first people that got me the idea of doing my own podcast when I was on yours as a guest. So it's a
oh,
pleasure returning the favor after 3 years.
oh, fantastic.
Imran, you've got like a really interesting background. I've known you for a while, and your background being in Australia. Just for the listeners, he's based in Australia. Whereabouts are you in Australia at the moment?
I grew up in Adelaide, but I'm based in Sydney now.
Great, great. Imran, could you give us or give the listeners like a little bit about your life before we get into the specifics about, like, say, the Islamic community or the Islamic finance in Australia?
Yeah, sure thing. So I was born in Adelaide, grew up in Adelaide. So all my family's still there, my immediate family, but my background is I'm half Chinese, half Malay. So my dad's Chinese, mum's Malay, and yeah, they never intended to kind of stay in Australia, though. I think they always intended to come study in Australia, go to the UK, and come back to Malaysia. But I think my dad came to Australia, loved it, and my poor mum, she's a kampong girl from the village, so poor thing's stuck here for I don't know how 45 years or whatever. So yeah, that's how we ended up in Australia.
Imran, you've got you grew up in Australia. What about your academic background? What did you study at university?
So I'm actually not a real banker. So I initially studied. I was actually in Cairo, so I was studying to become a chiropractor, and and it was around the time of September 11, and I got married at that time, and just there's a lot going on, like a lot of racism, a lot of challenges as we've all faced Muslims in the West, and so and around that time, I got into the Masters of Chiro program in Sydney, and I just remembered thinking, man, I don't want to touch hairy men's backs for the rest of my life. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. But it just felt, it wasn't my thing. And so my wife and I were studying Arabic at the time, and we thought, we were either going to do the whole overseas thing. But we thought, let's try academia. And so we did a master's of arts in Islamic studies, which was amazing. It was such a enjoyable experience. And alhamdulillah, we did quite well in that. And then we got scholarships to do the PhD in Islamic studies at Melbourne Uni.
Great. And your master's, was that studying like theology, or was that studying other things, or what was that studying about?
It was a really interesting master's. It was really flexible, and we could essentially kind of tailor the course to how what we wanted to study. So I remember, I wanted to study the history of, Islam in Southeast Asia. So my supervisor, we kind of formulated a question around that. And then, we'd do that. And it was really an excuse, I guess, for us just to read my dad's library. Alhamdulillah, mashallah, my parents have this amazing library. And it was literally just 1.5 years of just going through that library and going through all the different areas. And we ended up doing a thesis from that. So then we got into the PhD. So I obviously went down the kind of Islamic finance route, and my wife, her focus is on talaq and khula and all the issues related to Muslim women and divorce. So it was always kind of, Islamic law and how it operates in a non-Muslim context is what we had a particular interest in. And at that time, we were also, we come from, both my wife and I come from pretty active families. So we're doing a lot of kind of courses, and we have a teacher from Nigeria, a guy called Nuruddin Lemu. If he ever listens to this, such an amazing guy, mashallah. And so he was the one that kind of got us really thinking around, Islamic law, how it applies in different contexts, and looking at our particular situation in Australia.
So, Imran, how did you first hear about Islamic finance?
It was interesting. My thesis initially was going to be about religious authority. I was particularly interested in how religious authorities conferred, and my whole argument was, the potential establishment of an equivalent Majlis Urubi lil-Iftah wal-Buhuth, the European Council of Fatwa Research. We don't have any of that in Australia, so that was my kind of initial interest. And then I remember I was at a mate's house, and they were arguing about Islamic financing, as everybody does, and what to do and all that kind of stuff. And it just, like, I don't know, man. It's like my Chinese side of, doing business and my Malay side of loving Islam just kind of merged together. And then I just had this a real interest in Islamic financing, and in particular how do Muslims in the West, assuming that you're trying to be on the deen and practice the faith, how do you grapple with these issues, given the riba or whatever your interpretation of riba is prevalent, and we're very much in an interest-based economy. So what do you do is essentially was my thesis.
You did your PhD studies, and you talked a little bit about that, but I think you also wrote a book. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what the book was about?
Yeah, so the PhD is not when talking about Islamic finance, and people think I have a PhD in Islamic finance. A lot of the PhDs and a lot of research in Islamic finance is very financy. So there's very, very technical. It might be about, I don't know, regulatory frameworks on Islamic finance, or all that kind of stuff. Like it's quite banking and finance focused. But mine was actually in Islamic studies, and the particular question I was interested in was, riba there's no question on the riba, right? There's no question on the prohibition of riba, one of the major sins. But practically speaking, in the Australian context or in the Western context, how do you interpret riba? So, for example, the standard interpretation of riba being, mazid min ra's al-mal, anything, an increase on the principal is considered riba. And riba wa fa'ida nafs al-shay. Yeah, the riba and interest is the same thing. And that's the it's hard to say vast majority of scholars, because there's no ijma' on ijma', as you're aware, but my essential question was I would interview not all, but a lot of shuyukh from Australia and the UK on the interpretation of riba. Like what was riba? What was the interpretation of riba? And what I wanted to tease out from that question was, to what extent do people consider the modernist interpretation of riba? But I found by and large everybody held that view that riba and fa'ida or interest is exactly the same. The next question was, what do you do? Like, okay, if riba is interest, riba is a major sin. What do you do as a Muslim in Australia or the UK? Can you buy a house or not? Can you get a credit card or not? What do you do with your savings? What do you do with the interest on your savings account? So practically, what exactly do you do given this prohibition? And so that was the kind of that was my thesis, and then obviously the book stemmed from that. But in the book, I also talked about my personal experience being, I guess being an academic, but then also being a practitioner of Islamic financing as well.
And your day to day, you work in the industry, right?
Yeah. So I look after Islamic financing at a major bank, and so I've been working in the industry for about it's embarrassing to say, but about 14 years now.
Wow, mashallah, mashallah. Imran, when we talk about Islamic finance in Australia and Muslims in Australia, obviously Australia unfortunately has been in the news for not the right reasons, but the Muslim communities in Australia is not new and it's quite diverse. Could you talk a little bit about the Muslim communities in Australia and how Islamic finance plays a role in the economy over there?
I'd like to nostalgically think that Islamic principles of money and trade, were introduced way before white colonization. If you think of going way back to, my ancestors, Orang Bugis, Orang Makassar, so people from Makassar in eastern Indonesia, from Kalimantan, from Orang Bugis, the Bugis tribe, they would come, similar to how they would travel across the Indian Ocean with the monsoon winds, and they would trade with indigenous communities up in Arnhem Land, up north, and they would trade in Trepang, which is like the sea slug, which they would then export to or trade with Chinese Chinese markets. So that was a trade that was going back and forth for quite some time. These Orang Makassar would trade and interact with the local communities. They'll marry. They'll sometimes fight. Sometimes exchange cultures, etc. So, for example, the term for white man in some of the languages up north is Belanda. Belanda means is Dutch in Indonesian. So I would like to think nostalgically, I don't know how far it's true, but I would imagine that they would have some form of Islamic trade that was kind of in part on the local communities up north. But I think post and if you just think of Australian Muslim migration to Australia, you had that interaction up north right up until the White Australia policy. And then you had Afghan Cameleers that came from northwestern frontier province, and also and really opened up Australia's interior with camels, and they also married and interacted with the local Aboriginal tribes. So I'm sure at some point as well they would be fundraising for massages that they built. They would be doing some sort of trade, and I'm sure some sort of Islamic rulings around trade and economy were imparted. But if you think about like the more recent migration, I guess in the post World War II migrations, post White Australia policy migration, we're a pretty eclectic community. So we come from over 70 different nationalities, as many or more linguistic groups, largely a refugee and an unskilled migrant population. So it's not like not like the US, where a lot of uh, migrants, notwithstanding the African American communities, but the kind of the migrants that came across were very much student populations. For us, it's very much a refugee and unskilled migrant population that constitute the vast majority of the population here, with the exception of certain races. So, say for example, a lot of the early Egyptians, Indians, Pakistanis are typically more of a uh, skilled migration. And recently from India and Bangladesh, more skilled migration. But the other Muslims that formulate the bulk of the community here, the Lebanese, the Turks, Bosnians, Afghans, Somalis, are generally, that kind of demographic. So I think, very diverse communities. We're probably about, according to the 2021 census, around 850 odd thousand. So probably about, I think 2.3%, I think it was. And very young population. So 50% of them are under the age of 25.
Would you say, like, you obviously spent some time in the UK during your studies for the PhD. Um, do you see any similarities between the Muslim communities in the UK and in Australia?
Yeah, 100% in terms of the demographic. So again, like you guys are a lot of a large migration from Pakistan and Bangladesh. But in terms of the demographic of the community, I think it's pretty similar. So it's not it's when I say that, it's different from North America and that migration. But obviously in the UK you have your population is huge, and then you've also got all these other nationalities coming in as well. But where you guys have many, Pakistani, Bengali communities, ours will probably be more Lebanese and Turkish that constitute the majority. And so that shapes the kind of flavor of an Australian Islam versus an Islam in all the Muslim communities in the UK.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think a large part of Australia's Muslim communities is, as you said, it's based on things like migration, and also Australia's trade with some of the neighboring Muslim majority nations like Malaysia and Indonesia. Um, so yeah, and then obviously you have this like growing and young Muslim population in Australia, but Islamic finance is not that developed in Australia, right? It's not. It's quite nascent or quite small.
Yeah. It's still pretty small. I mean, we're not like the UK, for example. We don't have any government support. So we're the UK, back then with the FSA and the changes to stamp duty and tax laws, etc. We don't have any of that. So we had initially. It was interesting actually when I started. The first thing I did when I started my current work, the first thing I did was we did a conference. We just did an Islamic finance conference, and with the University of La Trobe at the time, and we thought, we're just gonna just start the discussion. And at that conference, we managed to get the assistant treasurer at the time, a guy called Nick Sherry, and a former Liberal leader, John Hewson, to be the keynote speakers. And I think what was interesting was that was the first kind of public statement from the government that talked about Islamic financing and brought it to some level of discussion. And that was a time where it was that was the time when it was around the GFC or just after the GFC. There was still a lot of uncertainty in terms of capital markets, and so they were actively looking at other sources of funding. And in Australia, we borrow, I don't know what the latest figure is, but it's like about 100 billion from capital markets every year. And when those capital markets froze up, they were looking at alternative markets to tap. So Islamic finance kind of made sense given our proximity to, in the Pacific, the region. So it made sense to kind of at least have a look at it. So that was the first kind of government kind of, I guess, discussion on Islamic financing. And then after that, there was this thing called the Ken Henry Tax Review, and that was like a review of Australia's tax policy, and Islamic finance featured in that. There was another paper called the Johnson Report, which was intended to how do we make Australia a financial center in the region. Islamic finance was mentioned in that, and after that, there was a Board of Taxation review on Islamic financing, and that was quite significant because I think there's only been like 6 Board of Taxation reviews historically, and they had a very high success rate on terms of implementation. But after that, that was like about over 10 years ago. After that, nothing, just no interest from the government. We had some little states. So Victoria changed some laws in relation to stamp duty for retail financing, but largely no support from the government. So I think that's probably the major difference between the UK and Australia. And I think that obviously has contributed to the industry not really taking off in a sense.
So Imran, when you look at Islamic finance in the UK compared to Australia, like why does the Australian government doesn't seem too supportive of the industry?
I think first of all, in the UK, they've got a long history of engagement with the GCC and the Gulf. Like there's a lot of investment that spans, decades of people from the GCC coming investing. Mayfair, you got all these investors there. It's a holiday destination. London obviously is a hub, so they kind of need to be across all these innovative industries and niche industries. Whereas Australia is not like it's kind of a hub, but it's kind of an outpost. يعني آخر الدنيا, like at the end of the world. So I think from that perspective, we're not really we're not at the same level, obviously, as London, New York, even Singapore sometimes. But so I think there's that level that we're just not as kind of in tune on a international finance center perspective. Like if you look at all the countries or most of the countries that made amendments to facilitate Islamic financing, got the UK, Hong Kong, Singapore, Luxembourg. They're all centers. You know what I mean? I mean, South Africa's not, but the other ones are very much financial centers. Whereas Australia, yeah, it's kind of there. So I think that plays a role. I think definitely politics would have played a role in kind of I think when you introduce anything in legislation related to Islam or Muslims, I think it's always politically challenging. So I think that played a role for sure. But yeah, and also just market. We don't see as many investors coming into the region, coming to Australia. I mean, there are some, but then it's not like there's heaps of them. And so, for example, so let me just gather my thoughts a bit. So I think that for all those reasons, I think it's kind of there, but it's not a high priority, and so I think it's just been left on the shelf.
And for the retail side, are there lots of providers of Islamic finance? Like, is it easy for Australians to get Sharia compliant products like home financing or car financing or anything like this?
Yeah, definitely. So there's products available. So the oldest and largest one is MCCA. So they've been around for I think 30 odd years. I think I'm not sure exactly how long, but I think probably about 30 years. And they were the real pioneers of Islamic finance in Australia. So they start off as a kind of a cooperative. They pooled funds. They had a very very Sharia compliant structure, musharaka, mutanaqisa structure for their offering. And around I would say around the 2000s, early 2000s, there was a guy called Dr. Abdur. There was a guy called Dr. Abdurrahim Ghaus who came and essentially revolutionized the market here in Australia. And he offered, or he developed this kind of ijara munta bit tamlik or tamalluk structure that allowed that allowed Muslims to get home financing that was relatively comparable with conventional banking. And sorry, let me start again. Around the early 2000s, there was a guy called Dr. Abdurrahim Ghaus, who was actually Anwar Ibrahim's right hand man. So he actually is very close with Anwar Ibrahim. And at the time when Anwar Ibrahim got detained for the first time, he actually sought Australia gave him asylum, and he actually ran Anwar Ibrahim's Free Anwar Ibrahim campaign from Australia, and at the same time revolutionized the Islamic finance industry.
Wow.
So he was the one that kind of made a change from the Musharaka Mutanaqisa structure, and that structure is problematic, not problematic, but it's challenging from an economic perspective for a whole variety of reasons that we can talk about. But he managed to, I guess, develop a new structure called the ijara, like an ijara muntabit tamlik structure, or more debt-based, sale-based structure, and that allowed Islamic financing to be very much competitive with conventional home financing, and that's when I guess Islamic financing really took off in a major way. And they're still very much the large guys, the big boys. There are others. So there's Amana Islamic Finance and other Islamic finance providers that are there. So I guess that and they're doing pretty well, I think, I would say.
I really want to understand a bit more about this structure you mentioned about Musharaka Mutanaqis, as it's called.
Yeah.
And also the Ijara product. Maybe obviously we had Haris Irfan, who was obviously a well-known banker in the early 2000s. Wrote the book Heaven's Bankers, advised people to check out episode 7. And we've had other guests on as well talking about Islamic finance and some of the Sharia compliant structures that are used in the market compared to the theory. And you obviously coming from academia, you've written and you've read and you've researched a lot about the different Islamic finance structures there are.
Yeah.
Why, to me, Imran, one of the things that I find interesting is that Islamic finance, the system the financial offering or proposal is a lot different to say the fiat-based, riba-based system. But as you've just said, it was more of a musharaka kind of risk sharing, where it's a more wholesome system. But in order to propel the market forward, you needed to go down this debt route. Why do you think the pioneers or the people in Australia decided to go down this road?
I think it's reflective of the industry at large. I think, obviously the founding fathers or forefathers of Islamic economics, from Mit Ghamar, really went down the profit and loss sharing structures, musharaka, mudaraba, equity-based structures. And I think, from a practical perspective, it doesn't always from a practical perspective, it's challenging in a debt-based, interest-based world that we live in. So I think obviously there's a certain amount of pragmatism that went on there, and I think and I think Harris talks about that really well actually in his book. And we've had some discussions on it as well. And I think if you look at a lot of the balance sheets as well, it's largely sale-based structures, so ijara, commodity murabaha structures at play. I think from the Australian context, it's interesting. They had MCCA initially, and I don't want to speak on behalf of MCCA, but I've written about this, so I guess I can talk about it to some extent. And I've interviewed some of the founding members of them that have been very kind to me, and been very open in some of the experiences they've had. And with the musharaka mutanaqisa structure, there's always an issue related to capacity and funding. So I always give an example for those of you who are not kind of familiar with Islamic financing, is that, say for example, we got, four mates, we all get together, we all put in cash, and we have a musharaka structure, and we draw lots, and Hassan, you get the house, right? So you get the house, you're living in the house. We've each put in 100K. You buy a house for 400,000, and you're paying rent, which is great, right? So you're living in the house. You're paying. We're getting a rental commensurate with what we've put in terms of our shares in the musharaka. So that's fine. And then 30 years off, you pay the house, like all good. And then, all right, now who gets the house? Ahmed gets the house, which is fine. That's fantastic. But then, people within the structure are still renting. We're getting kicked out of the house, etc. So there's always a challenge of funding it. There's always a challenge of capacity, because there's a mismatch in terms of the long dated debt. The long dated relationship in terms of how long it takes for people to pay off their house, and so people start to get itchy feet, and then they start to leave. And then when they start to leave, then it really breaks down. The whole structure kind of breaks down. Without a viable funding or liquidity line, it would end up being very challenging. There's also long wait times. There's also expectations on returns on equity, and it's often more expensive. So the structure is challenging from an economic perspective, because it's always on a very small scale, and it's challenging to grow and expand, and for people to get access to it. And then you have customer complaints, and people are used to instant financing. They're not used to waiting lines. They're not willing to pay more money. And what's interesting also is that with the musharaka, the experience in Australia was that if we're doing business, bro, if we're going into business, we've got a musharaka together, or mudaraba, whatever it is, profit and loss. The profit, if we make profit, right, we share the profit, right, because we're brothers, right? We're honest, we're brothers. But what happens is, because Muslims are unfortunately not the best in terms of business dealings, what would happen is that they would actually they would get financing, even sometimes from a bank or from family. They would buy out the shares of the other person, and they would take all the upside. And in the Australian market and the Australian economy, there was massive property boom. So they would literally take all the profits, and they wouldn't share the profits with the cooperative. But when it came to a loss, they would definitely come back and make sure they share the losses. So it's almost as if people, or Muslims, because of their character during that time, did not share in the proper spirit of the musharaka or mudaraba model. And I think this is a problem. And so there's often, if if you can't trust the other people or the people that you're doing business with, there's a high moral hazard incentive for one person or one party to falsify the profits. So say, for example, if we go into a kebab business, I know the kebabs, you're the cash guy. Say it's a mudaraba, you inject cash, I'm putting in my expertise. I might be making 100% profit, but I can go to you, oh, bro, you know what? Sorry, man. tough times, I only made, 6%. So we share 3% goes to you, 3% goes to me. And there's no way for you to, if you want to kind of make sure that I'm doing the right thing, then you'd have to get an auditor come in and someone that knows the kebab business, check out my numbers, etc. So that all adds to the costs, and that adds to the complexity of the profit and loss sharing or musharaka and murabaha models. And so, from a practical perspective, that's challenging. And I think for me, one thing that really struck me or that made me really think about it is, my friend who is my teacher, Nuruddin, Ustaz Nuruddin, who did a lot of microfinancing in Nigeria, and he did microfinancing for poverty alleviation. So I was like, oh, so bro, so you do musharaka structures, mudaraba musharaka structures? And he's like, no, actually, we just do ijara. We do sale-based structures, ijara, murabaha type structures. And because they don't want you in their business, they just want the financing. They want to do this small microfinancing. And so in that context, do you insist on what Islamic economists perceive to be a more Islamic structure, or do you go with a structure that works? And that also follows on from some of the discussions I've had with, a lot of the Sharia advisors, on this topic. And it's, in mu'amalat, right? In mu'amalat, where you have two equal mu'amalat structures, musharaka or ijara, both are permitted. Is there more barakah in choosing one over the other? Or do you insist on one? Say, for example, would you insist on a musharaka structure, even though it didn't give the social, say, for example, in the context of in Nigerian microfinance, would you insist on a musharaka structure, even though it has a more of a worse detrimental effect on the local economy and community, or would you use an equally permitted structure, ijara or murabaha, but it achieved a poverty alleviation from a maqasid al-sharia perspective? So that kind of, I think for me personally, I think it should be, we should have a more of a maqasid al-sharia approach and contextual approach, and be to an extent structure agnostic. And it really depends on the context in which structure is best. But having said that, I do hear all the arguments. Harris Arafan's book, I've read it. I've had some discussions with him, and I definitely see his perspective. Mahmoud Al-Gamal as well. I 100% see their perspective on it, and I think those voices of dissent are incredibly important as well, because you can get into or the industry can get lazy and just keep on punching out these sale-based products and not really adding much value from a maqasid perspective. Sorry, man, I just went on for a bit.
No, no, not at all. I think that's really interesting, and I think what you're saying is not just specific to Australia. I think it's to the global industry, and
Yeah.
I think it's the issue is that the most of the Islamic finance industry is working within, as I mentioned, the riba-based system, where you're regulated by a central bank, and if you're regulated by a conventional central bank, which believes in this idea of fiat currency and all these things, and it kind of goes back to what you just said about how human beings are human beings, right? And they only look at profit when the times are good, and when the times are bad, they're happy to share the risk with everybody else.
Yeah, 100%.
So the economic offering just seems to be a bit different, because like when I spoke, I think when I talked to Harris, and I've talked to other people, like when I talked to one of the pioneers who was influential in helping create one of the oldest Islamic banks. When I talked to him, he basically said, look, to me, this was like about 11 years ago. He said to me, look, we had to work within the system. So we had to use like temporary products like commodity murabaha, like these like tawarruk structures to fit in with the central bank and their regulations. But the actual essence of Islamic finance or Islamic economics is done through like mudaraba. Like when you explain to people what a mudaraba is in a real micro level, there could be complete loss of capital. If you imagine telling somebody, okay, fine, you put it in a mudaraba deposit account, you as the Rabb al Mal, but there is a chance that you could lose completely all your money. Of course, somebody's going to say like, no, I'm not going to, invest my money in this kind of account or this kind of like mechanism. So I guess like convincing people that it's a completely different economic offering is difficult, right?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And but I also see from the practitioner's perspective, like you have people like Rafi Hanif is a giant in this industry, talking about market share. And, it's all about obtaining market share, getting that, the upper hand's always better than the lower hand, but getting that market share before you can really influence and change things. Then obviously people would argue that Habibi, we've been going for 30, 40 years and nothing's really changed. So I definitely hear both sides of the argument.
Yeah, would you also say that the issue here is like people don't like risk, right? Especially banks or like traditional lenders of finance, they don't like too much risk. So like if I'm proposing something to you like a venture capital or private equity sort of thing that requires a lot of risk, right? Kind of if you think like Shark Tank, Dragon's Den sort of thing, like where the investor's putting a lot of capital in, he's putting a lot of risk in that he's in the back of their mind, they know that they could lose complete capital. So I kind of and then but like as I said, like if you bring it back to like a banking, traditional banking in the conventional space, it's like yeah, people don't like too much risk.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And there's often socioeconomic factors at play. So, if you're talking about refugee and unskilled migrant populations, people that are coming here, they're trying to establish themselves, um, and and kind of do it in the right way. Um, when you present a a type of venture capital structure, um, it's challenging for them. They have to think about their livelihood. They have to think about their kids, establishing a place for their kids, and because of the power structures at play, we don't have the sometimes we don't have the luxury of being able to, you know, uh, invest. Say, for example, a couple, I don't know, a couple $100,000 in a venture capital um, a vehicle. So if you look at a lot of the venture capital industries in America and stuff, they come from a very privileged position in the sense that they can allocate a certain portion of their funds to kind of have a bit of a crack at certain things. I'm not saying that it couldn't be done. I'm just trying to I'm just trying to kind of contextualize sometimes, you know, when you're dealing with like say for example in the Australian context, I work in the industry, so I'm very comfortable with. So let me say that again. Um, I think it depends on the context. I think we have to also consider the communities that we serve, and it really comes down for me. It really comes down to context. Like, if you're offering Islamic financing for microfinance in Nigeria, as the case of my teacher, is that you would use the structure that would best alleviate um, uh, that would be best suited for poverty alleviation that the local community would use. There's no point creating a great Islamic venture capital structure in that context, if people are one not going to use it and two create more of a detriment. So it really depends on the context. I think definitely in some of the more mature markets in the Muslim world, in Saudi, in UAE, in Malaysia, 100% they should be innovating a lot more and experimenting in some of the beautiful structures that we have, um, and, uh, and working hard at it. I'm not making excuses for what we're doing in Australia, but again, in Australia, we're in a minority context. You know, we're dealing with families that are trying to establish themselves, get a house for their kids, not being in rental properties that they can be kicked out of, having to move schools, kids are uprooted. So you can kind of I have, coming from an academic background where you like, have a certain view of what is Islamic, certain view of what's right. When you're actually having to practically develop a product that will work for the community, I think it's different.
Yeah, and it also seems that, as you mentioned, right, I think when you gave the example of the kebab shop, like a lot of transaction cost can play a role um, in
Yeah, 100%. Like if you go to someone and you offer a product and they have to pay double stamp duty on it, I would say you would find it'll be a great product. You can say it's the most Islamic product. Habibi, no one's gonna take it up.
But if you think about it, right, that's not just specific to Australia. Like it took the UK a long time to do that, to change that law, and also even in Muslim majority countries, albeit like they're secular, like Turkey or Turkey or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, 100%.
Yeah, it took them a long time to change their tax legislation. I think they only did that in like 2010 or 11, so it's not been a long time um, that they did that. Uh, and then I guess the other area that is a challenge, not just for Australia again, but for all markets, is education, right? Education and awareness of Islamic finance or Islamic financial products is a bit of a challenge for the customers. What do you think that there needs to be more efforts in educating the market in Australia?
Yeah, I think people, a lot of people have no idea about Islamic financing, and that was my whole point around the book, and also my podcast actually is because I'm trying to get financial literacy in general. I think we struggle with, particularly in Australia. Like we have a lot of these crazy Ponzi schemes and people plowing massages, imams plowing copious amounts of money into like straight up Ponzi schemes or so-called Sharia compliant Ponzi schemes. Um, uh, and I think so. One on a financial literacy perspective, it's challenging. Islamic finance is like people think Islamic finance is like a qard hasan type of thing that they don't not aware of the structures that are and the different structures that are out there. And then there's a lot of the shuyukh or imma. They would all have a view on Islamic financing, or whether or not to buy a house, or can you buy a house, or can you not buy a house. But the a lot of the imams, للأسف, are not really across Islamic financing as well. So that um, they might be specialists in قراءة al-Quran, or hadith, or stories of the prophets. But when it comes to actually banking and finance and economy and how these things are structured, they actually, it's the knowledge is definitely not there. And what I find in this area is that although there's obviously a lot of information, a lot of stuff out there, people just want to answer. So people want people want you to tell them, Habibi, go for it. You can get a loan from the ANZ or whatever bank that you want to get it from. So it's there's a lot of lack of understanding for sure. But that's not only here. I actually get surprised in Malaysia, where some of my cousins and stuff like that are asking me questions around Islamic financing and stuff like that. So I think that's a industry wide problem.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think I was last time I was in Malaysia was in 2013, so it's been a while. But I remember talking to some of the banks there, and a lot of their customers were not actually Muslim, which I thought was really interesting. I don't know if that's the same now. Imran, as we bring the podcast to a close shortly, one thing I wanted to get your take on was like, what are your thoughts on the current landscape of Islamic finance, and where do you see it going in the next couple of years?
I think it's definitely growing. Like it's not it's still very niche though. I think we got to keep that into perspective. I think it's a very niche area, and it serves a specific population. So, as I said, so let's say 800,000 Muslims, half of them are under the age of 25. So that's then how many of that 400,000 odd are religious? Like some obviously don't care. They just do whatever. So let's say half of them are religious. So 200,000, and then you have ikhtilaf, the difference of opinion in Islam, difference of opinion of going here, going there, doing all sorts of stuff, different madahib, different views, different manahij, different paths that people follow. So let's say 100,000 people, and then how many of those? So 100,000 people, let's say, are interested in Islamic financing. Then how many of those are actually, can qualify for home financing or qualify for some sort of Islamic finance offering? So I think we've got to keep that into perspective. So I think, but having said that, we've got a lot of things going for us. So as I mentioned, very young population. It's a very sticky population in terms of if we can offer products, they're going to grow. Very entrepreneurial. So you've got some really um, uh, amazing businesses that are coming up. So I think it definitely grow. I think without government support, I think there's only so much it can grow. And also, the one factor that is really can make it really grow is Islamic investors from the region, from Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, Singapore, and also the GCC. If they were to come in a major way, I think that would be a really big game changer. And I think there's no reason why um, they wouldn't find Australia interesting. If you think of, it's a AAA rated country, highly regulated, um, regulated destination, increasing trade linkages. You'd think that they'd take more of an interest, but I think their focus is still very much America, Europe. But if they were to think of Australia and this part of the world as access to the broader Asia Pacific region, I think that would be a big game changer. The only challenge with that is kind of return expectations and also currency challenges. So it's I think sorry, long story short, I think it will generally grow. I think it definitely um, is growing, but I think it could grow a lot more.
Yeah, no, I agree. And do you think like the likes of challenger banks or fintechs can disrupt the industry or help the industry go forward?
I, I was kind of hoping that they would more, um, to be honest, but it doesn't seem like they are. So it doesn't seem like they're making that much of an impact. I'm just thinking more broadly in the industry globally, but in Australia we don't really see much um, of that activity. There was obviously recently, as it's quite well publicised, the IBA, Islamic Bank of Australia, were trying to establish an Islamic bank in Australia, and they've handed back their license, probably demonstrating how challenging it is. So we don't haven't seen that currently, but what we are seeing is more products, I think, in the market, which is fantastic. But again, it's quite slow, but it's definitely there. There's definitely something there, but it's not. It's still very niche.
Yeah, absolutely. And Imran, what are your current projects and what are you working on these days?
Other than my general Islamic finance work, I've I've written the book, but I actually haven't launched my book. So I did a book launch in Malaysia at the Australian High Commission there, but I haven't actually done one in Australia, and I actually haven't done anything in relation to the book. So I probably should do a book launch at some point. Also, writing. I got a few journal articles that I'm looking to write on Islamic finance and the experience of Islamic financing in Australia. I think it's a unique kind of experience being in the minority context, particularly one where we don't have any government kind of uh, tax support. And just my podcast, Muslim Money. So just interviewing interesting people like yourself, leaders in the industry, and also local kind of community members here in Australia, and sharing their experience of money and how they navigate it.
And Muslim Money is on Apple, Spotify, and other platforms.
Yeah, yeah, it's on all the platforms. So yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, check it out.
No, it's great. No, Imran Lam, this has been a really great conversation, and I wish you all the best. And thanks for coming on again.
Habibi, thank you so much. Take it easy.
All the best.